Smoke curled into the night sky. The cries of the conquered mixed with the crackle of burning homes. She stumbled through the ashes, calling out for her husband, but he would never answer again. A figure stepped out of the firelight, his face hidden beneath a steel helm, his blade still wet. She fell to her knees and begged for mercy. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The Vikings hadn't come for gold, nor glory. They came for something far darker. Her screams were carried away by the wind as the waves crashed against the shore. What they did to the wives of defeated warriors was worse than death itself. But why did they do it? And what belief made such cruelty seem righteous? For the Vikings, war was more than survival, it was a sacred path to honor. A man's worth was measured by the blood on his blade and the fear he left behind. When their longships touched foreign shores, they brought not armies but storms, sudden, merciless, and absolute. Villages along the coasts of Britain and across the rivers of the East learned that the sound of oars in the mist meant one thing: ruin was coming. They believed that those who fell in battle were blessed. To die with a sword in hand was to be chosen by Odin himself, carried to Valhalla, where endless feasts and endless wars awaited. But for those who survived, those who conquered, the spoils of war were proof of divine favor. Gold, land, slaves, and women were the trophies of power. In their sagas, the women of defeated men were called booty of the blade, rewards granted to the victorious. Some were taken as concubines, others as slaves. In Norse law, they were property, passed between warriors as easily as coin. Strength was justice, mercy was weakness. And to show mercy to the conquered was to defy the gods themselves. Each raid followed the same brutal rhythm: strike fast, take everything, burn what remained. Their ships glided silently through the fjords, reaching far into kingdoms unprepared for their fury. From the monasteries of Lindisfarne to the villages of the Slavic lands, the pattern was always the same: terror, plunder, and the enslavement of those left behind. But not every act of cruelty came from greed. Some acts were darker, driven by vengeance and ritual. In the heart of these conquests, beneath the stories of gold and glory, lay a hidden practice, one that even Viking chroniclers whispered about with unease. Among their victories was a ritual of revenge, one that few historians speak about. When the fighting stopped, silence never meant peace. It meant the counting had begun: the living, the wounded, and those who would never see freedom again. The wives of fallen warriors were dragged from the ruins, their faces streaked with ash and tears. The air was thick with smoke and grief, broken only by the clinking of chains and the guttural shouts of the conquerors. Children cried out for their mothers, but the Vikings had no patience for mourning. The defeated were not people in their eyes, they were prizes. The strong were bound together with ropes around their necks, the weak were left behind. Those who resisted were struck down where they stood. For the Norsemen, hesitation was dishonor, and pity was weakness. Women who once carried the names of noble warriors were stripped of everything: their jewelry, their clothes, their dignity. The men who had fallen to protect them were now corpses beneath their feet. They were forced to march toward the shore, past the bodies of their kin, the smell of death mixing with the salt of the sea. The ships waited like open jaws. Long, narrow vessels with dragon heads carved into their prows, symbols of power and fear. Captives were thrown aboard, pressed together in the cold, dark hulls. Every crash of the waves was a reminder that there would be no return. Some whispered prayers to gods who no longer heard them, others stared blankly at the horizon, their tears lost to the wind. The warriors laughed above them, their victory songs rising with the storm. For them, this was the natural order: the strong take, the weak serve. As the ships pulled away from the burning coast, the flames of their homes grew smaller until they were nothing but a dim red glow against the night. And with that light went the last trace of their old lives. Yet captivity was only the beginning: their fate on Viking soil would strip them of everything human. When the longships reached Viking shores, the journey into darkness was far from over. The women, now broken by hunger and fear, were taken to the settlements, places of hard soil, bitter wind, and stricter laws than any they had known. Here, they were no longer seen as victims of war, but as thralls, property. Bought, sold, or gifted like tools of labor and pleasure. In the sagas, thralls are mentioned with the same indifference as livestock. They had no rights, no voice, no past. A man could trade one for a sword, a herd of cattle, or a chest of silver. Under Norse law, a warrior who took a captive woman as a concubine did not need her consent, his ownership was her fate. The law stones and runic carvings that survive from this age record such exchanges with cold precision, women's names carved beside values in silver or land, as if they were items to be weighed. They toiled in fields, carried water, ground grain, and served in the halls of their captors. Many were forced to share the beds of the men who had killed their husbands. Children born of these unions lived as half-free, reminders of violence that became lineage. Some captives, valued for their beauty or skill, were kept close to chieftains, others sent off in trade to distant lands. But the cruelty went deeper than enslavement. In moments of death and ceremony, these women became offerings. When a warrior died, his servants and concubines were sometimes chosen to follow him, through pain, through blood, through ritual. Their deaths were meant to honor the gods and escort their masters into the next world. To the Vikings, honor was for warriors. Women of the defeated had no souls worth saving. Their suffering was not tragedy, it was order, decreed by men and blessed by myth. Yet even this grim existence was only a shadow of what awaited some of them. Because the horror reached its peak during one of their most sacred rituals, a funeral. The day of the chieftain's funeral began in silence. The river was still, the air heavy with smoke from the pyres that had burned the night before. Men gathered in solemn ranks, their faces carved with pride and cruelty, for they were about to honor their fallen leader in the way their ancestors had taught them, through death offered for death. Among the captives, one girl was chosen. She was young, perhaps 16, taken months earlier in a raid across the sea. The others looked away when her name was spoken, for to be chosen was to vanish from the living. Warriors led her from the hall, and the village women, grim, quiet, bound by duty, took her to prepare. She was washed, dressed in fine linen, and adorned with gold bracelets that once belonged to her master's wife. They gave her intoxicating drinks, strong enough to cloud her thoughts, to make her believe she was chosen by the gods. But it wasn't mercy, it was preparation for death. As the day darkened, the chieftain's body was carried to his ship, laid upon silks, surrounded by weapons, bread, and mead. The girl followed, swaying between two men, her eyes dull from the drink. All around, voices rose in chant, low, rhythmic, ancient. They spoke of Odin, of Valhalla, of the great feast awaiting their lord. She was made to climb aboard the ship. There, in front of the watching crowd, the ritual began. Old women known as angels of death circled her, whispering words no one else could hear. They gave her more drink, stroked her hair, and led her toward the chieftain's cold body. Her hands trembled as they placed her beside him. She was told to smile, to greet her master as he awoke in the next world. And she tried, for a moment her lips curved upward, empty, frightened. The chanting grew louder, the drums deeper. The flames waited nearby. Then, silence. For a long breath, the world stopped, only the crackle of torches and the whisper of wind through the reeds. And in that silence, the final act began. The silence broke with the sound of chanting, deep, steady, relentless. The girl was surrounded now, the angels of death, moving closer, their faces hidden beneath veils. They whispered prayers to the gods, not for her, but for the man who already lay cold beside her. The people watched in reverence, not horror. For them, this was sacred. She looked once more at the sky, her breath trembling as the wine and smoke clouded her mind. A rope was placed around her neck, not violently, but with ceremony, as though it were a crown. Two men pulled from behind while another woman pressed her hand against the girl's mouth, muffling the final cry. The crowd did not flinch. This was the way of their world, the way loyalty was proven. When her body went still, the priestess raised a dagger carved with runes and plunged it beneath her ribs. Blood spilled quietly onto the silks that lined the chieftain's grave boat. She was no longer a thrall. In their eyes, she had become part of his eternity. In their twisted code, the wife's agony became proof of her devotion. Her screams were offerings to their gods. To them, this was balance, the man's life for his glory, the woman's death for his peace. The ship was set alight. Flames climbed the mast, swallowing the sails, the shields, the bodies. Sparks rose into the dusk like wandering souls, carried away by the wind. On the shore, the people sang, not mourning, but praising. They believed the fire would free the spirits, that the smoke would carry them to the halls of Valhalla. As the river glowed red beneath the burning sky, the music faded. Only the soft hiss of the fire remained, echoing against the water. And when the last flame died, so did her name. The scene falls to quiet, soft, somber music, the sound of waves returning to calm, as though the gods themselves had taken what they were owed. When the flames of the funeral faded, life in the Viking world carried on, for the living, and for those left in chains. The other captives returned to their labor, tending fields, grinding grain, or serving in smoky halls where they were never truly seen. A few, through time or cunning, found ways to escape. Some fled during raids or through trading ships that carried them far from the northern shores. Others were absorbed into Norse households, bearing children who would never know which blood flowed in their veins, conqueror or conquered. For many, survival meant silence. The horrors of the raid became distant memories buried beneath years of toil and winter. Generations passed, and the stories of the taken women became whispers in fireside tales, echoes of pain woven into myth. But as the centuries turned, the world around them began to change. Traders and missionaries from the Christian kingdoms of the south brought new gods, new laws, and new shame. The chronicles written by these outsiders condemned the old Viking rites as savage, their sacrifices as proof of godlessness. Kings who once ruled by the sword now sought legitimacy through the cross. Temples of wood gave way to churches of stone. Runestones, once carved to honor the fallen, stood beside crosses raised in repentance. The people no longer spoke of slave burials or ritual deaths, but the past did not vanish, it simply retreated beneath the surface. The blood of the old world remained in the soil, and the songs of the skalds carried fragments of it still. Even after the conversions, whispers of the old ways survived, and some say, so did the sacrifices. Centuries later, historians would question the truth behind these accounts. Were the rituals as brutal as described, or had the chroniclers, most of them foreign observers, colored their words with judgment and fear? Among the most cited sources is the 10th century Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, whose vivid report of a Viking funeral along the Volga became the foundation for this story. His manuscript, preserved in fragments and later compiled in the Risala, describes every moment with disturbing clarity, the intoxicating drinks, the chants, the death of the slave girl. Yet scholars debate whether he witnessed a single tribe's custom or a practice spread across the Norse world. Archaeology offers only traces, never certainty. At burial sites in Oseberg and Burka, the remains of women have been found laid beside high-ranking men, surrounded by weapons, jewelry, and burnt offerings. Some bones show cuts that may indicate ritual death, others appear untouched, leaving room for doubt. Artifacts from ship burials display both reverence and violence, a mingling of faith and fear. Historians such as Neil Price, author of The Viking Way, argue that sacrifice and slavery were inseparable from Norse belief, a reflection of a society where honor and terror coexisted. Others, like Judith Jesch, caution that foreign writers often exaggerated Viking cruelty to justify Christian conquest. They suggest that while isolated rituals of human sacrifice likely occurred, the scale and spectacle described by Ibn Fadlan may have been rare. Still, the consistency of these tales, from the sagas of Iceland to the writings of early missionaries, implies that at least part of the legend is rooted in truth. The Vikings lived in a world where the line between devotion and brutality blurred easily, where faith demanded proof paid in blood. Old runic stones, charred boats, and scattered bones remain as the only witnesses. They do not speak of exaggeration or mercy, only of people who believed that death was a doorway, and that loyalty had to follow through it. She vanished into legend, nameless, forgotten. Her face was never carved in stone, her name never written on a rune. The river carried her ashes away, and the wind scattered what remained of her story. Yet in the silence she left behind lies a truth that refuses to die. Her suffering was not just a moment of cruelty, it was the reflection of an age that mistook faith for dominance, and devotion for submission. Her death, like so many others, reminds us that behind the songs of conquest and glory, there were always voices that never got to sing. Centuries may have buried her beneath new gods, new kingdoms, and new laws, but the echoes of that night still linger, in the sagas, in the soil, in the uneasy reverence for the warriors who built their honor on the bodies of the defeated. She vanished into legend, nameless, forgotten. But her story reminds us of how cruelty hides behind faith and conquest.